When I first started out as a teacher, I braced myself for awkward or contentious moments, the so-called hot moments in the classroom. And if you're an instructor or a teacher, whether at a university or some other setting where adult humans are coming together to learn, this might be a familiar anxiety. What to do when things feel hard or contentious or when something harmful happens. Now, it turns out there's actually a lot you could do to get ahead of this. And today, I want to offer you 3 strategies that will help you with navigating these moments, but also getting out in front of them so that they happen less, they're not so charged when they do happen, and also, paradoxically, believe it or not, could lead to deepened trust in you as a leader and in the group if they're managed well. Hi, I'm Dr. Lena Achter, and I taught undergraduates for 6 years as a teaching fellow and instructor, and now teach relational skill building in organizational settings. And this is a framework that I developed while supporting other classroom discussion leaders with how to deal with difficult moments in their classrooms. My interest in this really started when I was part of a graduate seminar. It was a year-long thing that met every 2 weeks. One day, about 2/3 of the way through the year, a terrible argument erupted between two of the people there. One said something overtly racist to the other, and folks, let me tell you, everybody else in that room was frozen. As it escalated, nobody seemed to know what to do. The instructor didn't intervene, and we students were waiting for her to. What was happening was absolutely awful. And when it became clear that she wasn't going to, we didn't end up speaking up. Well, other students, not me, which I'll say more in a bit, didn't end up speaking up and intervening until it was quite late and it had spiraled quite badly. Now, class ended, and then 2 weeks later, we met again. And initially, it felt like we were just going to jump into class as usual and gloss over what had happened. But somebody raised her hand and said what everybody was thinking, which is that she was really uncomfortable with just proceeding and not acknowledging what had happened. And then the argument picked up where it had left off. The outcome was that neither of those students ended up returning to the class. In fact, one stormed out in that session after cursing all of us out. When we were discussing what happened later on, the instructor said that she was not wanting to intervene because she had too much power. She felt she had too much power to do so, and so expected us to intervene and figure it out. And we students were looking at her to intervene because she had the most power in the room. So there was just absolutely no clarity about this. And what we ended up doing was we made some guidelines at the suggestion of one of the students, and that served as, the support for our interactions going forward. The rest of the semester happened very smoothly. This incident was a real learning for me, including because I did not speak up. In fact, I wanted to fall through the floor. This rang all of my conflict aversion and avoidance bells. And I thought about it many times in the years since. It's one of the things that actually prompted me to learn some skills to handle this and then do some work teaching other instructors how to handle moments like this, which I did through my university's teaching center. Now, when I was first invited to do that, I was handed a bunch of slips of paper, so-called hot moments. And I think the expectation was we break up into small groups and we discuss how do we handle this scenario and how do we handle this scenario. The thing is, the problem with this is that by the time this hot moment has happened, it's already too late. If you compare it to a fire that's about to start, the candle has fallen on the floor and the floor is covered in hay. And the problem is now, how do we prevent this from spiraling? So in the example that I gave you with the graduate seminar, we did eventually make group agreements 2/3 of the way through. And I imagine that if we'd had those on day one before we really got stuck into the class, we would have had a few more options for where to move when this incident occurred, or some more clarity over, who is expected to say what, and also maybe some norms to call the behavior we were seeing in with. So the thing I want to offer you here is that these hot moments don't ever occur in a vacuum. They're part of a larger continuum, right, of class meetings and relationships, the whole of the class, right? So I want to invite you to think about the entirety of the engagement, the development of the class, the enrollment of students, and whatever you do on day one, as well as the arc of the class as a whole. Think of the whole thing as a container. And starting long before you meet, you can actually start setting that container up. And the things that you do in the lead up to and on day one will be far more important and effective than anything that you do in the moment to put out a fire that's already started. So, in other words, this is your house. Set it up the way that you want it and make sure that there are no flammables on the floor. Now, speaking of agreements and norms, many of you will be familiar with this practice. Group agreements, rules for the road, conversational guardrails, these are all names I've heard for them. They're good. I mentioned we developed them 2/3 of the way through. Going through and creating them at the start of whatever the engagement is a powerful practice and vastly, infinitely better than not having them at all. Posting them up so that they're always visible is another strategy that I've seen. Invoking them at the beginning of each meeting is another one. Now, here's the thing. A lot of group agreements sound really good, but often they need a little bit of skill in order to be implemented effectively. So what I want to offer is a practice that I've found to be really effective. Instead of treating them as just norms and agreements, treating them as skills that you are practicing with one another. Skills for being in relationship that you're practicing with one another, right? So I want to offer you a couple of examples of what I mean by treating these as skills and practices. And these are drawn directly from a couple of the lists that my students developed at the beginning of their semesters. One of them is active listening. So active listening as a practice and as a skill. Now, technically active listening, the counseling skill, is not something that is perfectly implementable in a classroom setting. And the spirit of it is be listening, fully present, etc., with your colleague when they're speaking. I would take it a step further, that active listening, it draws on two capacities. So the two skills with active listening are self-awareness and self-management. If you're anything like me, you have a mind that goes a mile a minute. If you've ever had the experience of listening to somebody and queuing up your response or maybe your rebuttal in your head as they're speaking, that's what I'm talking about. Being aware that I'm doing that and then doing the self-management of slowing myself down and letting myself really take in what the other person is saying and letting it land before I respond as opposed to react. Another common guideline is to take space and make space. So be aware of how much you're talking, make sure other people can talk. And that's another self-awareness one. And it's also about relational awareness and maybe also a little self-management. So being aware of how much I'm talking. Do I have the impulse to talk? Do I have the impulse to talk over people? And being also aware of how much the other participants in the room have spoken and ensuring that everybody else has a chance to come in if they want to, especially if they haven't spoken, if I'm going to speak up again, right? So these kinds of practices, these kinds of skills are vital and really powerful and transformative ways to implement relational culture change. And I can make another video about that in the near future. These are skills that I teach in one of my workshops, the first in the Building Organizational Shock Absorbers series. So the invitation is to think about your group agreements and community norms as practices and skills and to treat them accordingly. Practice these skills with one another. The third thing I want to offer is to not let things float by. Always address harm in the moment. So I'm going to speak about this from the standpoint of a bystander, which I was, and then talk about how it's especially important, even more important, if you're a leader. So back in the graduate seminar, I later apologized to the person. I pulled her aside and said, I thought what happened was extremely racist. I heard it as soon as it came out of her mouth, and I was super uncomfortable. And then she said to me, so why didn't you say something? And I didn't say something because I was uncomfortable. And about a million things happened in my mind. And what I heard come out of my mouth instantaneously was, you're right. I should have said something. Why didn't I say something? So in this scenario, I was a bystander, and that I should have said something absolutely holds. And it's even more important for a leader. So as a leader, as a classroom instructor, whether you know it or not, whether you feel it or not, whether you believe it or not, you have a lot of power in the room. By default, people are going to be looking to you to set the standards for what is and isn't okay in this space. So in the example from earlier, the professor said that she didn't want to intervene because she had too much power and assumed that we were going to sort it out. We had no idea about this, and so we were waiting for her to say something. Now, she could have delegated the ability to intervene at the beginning of the class if we were, for instance, laying out our norms, but in the absence of that communication, we did not know what was going on in her head. So, intervention doesn't have to be punitive, and it absolutely should not be shaming. As a leader, if you see something happen, if you're feeling a discomfort in your body, which is a big tell, slow things down. Invite people into your group norms if you have them, or if somebody has said something noxious, name it. Do not just let it float by. Things that you could say include, could you rephrase that? That's not language that's okay to use here. I'm really uncomfortable with how you're speaking to your colleague right now. Can we please pause? Right? Saying something, anything, even if it is imperfect, is profoundly important. I cannot emphasize how important it is. Reason is that if a leader is silent, for whatever reason, whatever might be going on in their head, it might be that they are just really conflict averse and frozen. It might be that they don't know how to handle a situation like this. It might be like with this instructor, that they think they have too much power in the room. It doesn't matter what's going on in their head. What the silence communicates is this. To the person who's causing the harm, it says, I am okay with how you're speaking or behaving to your colleague right now. To the person who's being harmed, it communicates, I am okay with how you are being spoken to or treated right now. And to everybody else in the room, it communicates, I am not going to hold anybody here accountable. Silence from a leader is tantamount to endorsement. Silence from a leader costs so much. And so when I was learning to do this work, one of the first things that I did was start working through my own conflict aversion. It was hard, and it's entirely possible, and it's so worth it. Now, ultimately, what happened with the class was that the student to whom the harmful thing was said repaired things with the professor. They met outside, even though she didn't return. And she and I stayed in touch for a while after. And this whole thing was a real lesson for me. And honestly, it was one of the things that kicked me off into my current form of work. So if this is interesting to you and you want to learn more about how we can show up as our best selves doing work we love and in our relationships and communities, I would love to have you here. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments and consider subscribing. Thank you so much.